When talking about beef, some people may think about Tupac and Biggie. Some people may think about Drake and Kendrick. Some people may think about Tom and Jerry. Some people may even think about Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant Chicken. But me personally, when I think about one of the biggest beefs in civilization history, I think about the Super Nintendo versus the Sega Genesis. Honestly, I wasn't even born when this beef was going on. But as a gamer, I feel like the recent beefs in gaming were not as big as this one. Today, it's more about who can run a game better, or who has the best graphics. But from what I've seen on the internet, with this era, it was a true war. It almost felt like people were gang affiliated. Having multiple consoles was not a common thing, so you had to choose a side. The Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo had so many classic games that some of them are still played today. They were both revolutionary, and it changed the gaming industry forever. In this video, we're gonna try to figure out which console is better overall, the Sega Genesis or the Super Nintendo. This video will touch on multiple categories, such as the hardware, the controllers, the graphics, the music, and the games, with a brief history of each consoles. Once again, this is going to be a long one, so go grab yourself a drink, a blunt, some food, anything you need, sit back, and enjoy the video. Also, before we start, I would really appreciate it if you guys liked and subscribed to the channel. It would mean a lot to me, and without further ado, let's get into it. Before the Sega Genesis launched, the home console industry was dominated by Nintendo. The NES had around 95% of the market share, which basically meant Sega was entering enemy territory. But Sega wasn't going to play by Nintendo's rules. They wanted to stand out, to be louder, cooler, and faster. After the commercial failures of the Sega Master System, Sega decided to come back swinging with a new console, the Sega Mega Drive in Japan, known as the Sega Genesis in North America. The Genesis actually came out before the Super Nintendo, giving Sega a head start and a strong selling point, 16-bit graphics. This was a big leap from the NES era. It launched in Japan on October 29, 1988, but it didn't make much noise there. Unfortunately for Sega, Super Mario Bros. 3 was released around the same time and completely stole the spotlight. The Mega Drive only managed to ship around 400,000 units in the first year. Not terrible, but nowhere near enough to challenge Nintendo. Things changed when Sega of America was established. The Genesis launched in North America in September of 1989, and that's when Sega started to find its identity. It was powered by a Motorola 68000 CPU, which gave it impressive speed and power for the time. Sega wanted to bring the arcade experience home, and that was their main pitch. But it wasn't just the hardware, it was about the attitude. Sega's marketing was aggressive, bold, and a bit cocky. They came up with one of the most iconic slogans in gaming history: Genesis does what Nintendo don't.
16-bit arcade graphics.
We can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
16-bit arcade action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
16-bit arcade hits.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
What Nintendo don't. The 16-bit Genesis system by Sega. Genesis does it all.
Their ads were fast-paced, full of energy, and targeted toward teens and young adults who were outgrowing Nintendo's family-friendly image. They even featured celebrities and athletes in their games and commercials to push that cooler image. Still, early on, sales were very slow. By the end of 1989, Sega had only sold about 500,000 units in the US. They needed something big, a face for the brand, and that is when Sonic the Hedgehog was born. Sonic was everything Mario wasn't: fast, rebellious, and full of attitude. And it worked. When Sonic the Hedgehog was released in 1991, the Genesis exploded in popularity. During the holiday season of 1991, the Genesis actually outsold the Super Nintendo, and by early 1992, Sega controlled roughly 65% of the US 16-bit market. From the 1991 holiday season through 1994, the Genesis dominated key periods, winning 4 consecutive Christmas seasons over its rival. A big part of that success came from Sega's approach. They offered a cheaper console and a larger, more diverse game library. Some people believe Sega's more open stance toward third-party developers, unlike Nintendo's restrictive licensing policies, also played a major role. This led to tons of unique and experimental games on the platform. From Streets of Rage to Shinobi to Phantasy Star and Gunstar Heroes. For a while, it really looked like Sega defeated Nintendo at their own game. The Genesis wasn't just a console, it was a movement. It represented speed, style, and freedom. And we can't talk about the Sega Genesis without talking about the blast processing.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? And what if you don't have blast processing?
Long story short, the blast processing was a made-up marketing term. People think it's because the Genesis has a faster CPU clock rate than the Super Nintendo. They use blast processing in commercials to lure people into buying the Sega Genesis. But again, it was only a marketing term, and it worked. People actually thought that the blast processing was something, when it really wasn't. The Genesis remains one of the most iconic consoles ever made. It pushed gaming forward, changed how games were marketed, and proved that Nintendo could be challenged. Before the Super Nintendo entered the scene, Nintendo was sitting comfortably at the top of the gaming world. The NES had completely dominated the 8-bit era, selling over 60 million units worldwide and capturing around 95% of the home console market. But by the late 80s, things were starting to shift. Sega had launched the Genesis, a faster, flashier 16-bit machine, and for the first time, Nintendo faced a real rival. The gamers were growing up. They wanted better graphics, deeper gameplay, and more mature experiences. Nintendo needed a response, and their response was the Super Nintendo. The Super Famicom was released first in Japan on November 21st, 1990, and it was an instant hit. It sold out almost immediately, moving over 300,000 units within hours of release. Nintendo's reputation, combined with a strong launch lineup including Super Mario World, F-Zero, and Pilot Wings, made it a must-have console. Less than a year later, the system arrived in North America on August 23, 1991, redesigned with the iconic purple and gray look. While Sega positioned itself as the cool, fast, rebellious option, Nintendo leaned into quality, innovation, and polished games. The Super Nintendo was powered by a Ricoh 5A22 CPU, technically slower than the Genesis, but it made up for it with better graphics and sound quality. Its Mode 7 feature allowed for rotating and scaling backgrounds in real time, creating that 3D-like effect seen in games like Super Mario Kart and F-Zero. And thanks to the Sony-designed SPC 700 sound chip, the Super Nintendo delivered some of the best music ever heard in gaming history. Nintendo's real strength was the games. The Super Nintendo built one of the most legendary libraries ever, not just in the 16-bit era, but in gaming history. Titles like A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, Donkey Kong Country, Star Fox, and Earthbound weren't just hits, they defined entire genres. And with the help from third-party developers like Squaresoft, Capcom, and Konami, the console became home to masterpieces such as Chrono Trigger, Street Fighter II, Mega Man X, and Super Castlevania 4. By 1992, the 16-bit console war was in full swing. Sega had an early lead with its 2-year head start, and edgy Genesis does what Nintendo don't marketing. But Nintendo fought back with exclusive titles, technical polishing, and unmatched brand loyalty. The release of Street Fighter II on the Super Nintendo was a massive turning point, and it boosted sales and helped Nintendo close up the gap. The Super Nintendo also had the advantage when it comes to presentation. It could display up to 32,768 colors on screen, compared to the Genesis 512, giving games a more vibrant and detailed look. And again, the Super Nintendo sound chip made amazing music, but we'll talk about the music later. By the mid-90s, Nintendo had regained the upper hand. When the dust finally settled, the Super Nintendo sold around 49 million units worldwide, surpassing the Genesis. Sega had pushed them harder than anyone before, but Nintendo's focus on quality, innovation, and long-term appeal ultimately helped them sell more consoles.
The Super Nintendo wasn't just another console, it was an era. It defined 16-bit gaming with heart, creativity, and timeless designs. Even over 30 years later, its games are still played, loved, and celebrated, proof that the Super Nintendo wasn't just a system, but a piece of gaming history.
The Sega Genesis controller is pretty simple. It has a nice shape, all black, but it only has 4 buttons, A, B, C, and the start button. They ended up releasing a 6-button controller, but that doesn't count. We're talking about the OG controller, the one that came with the console. Anyways, having 4 buttons can be a problem in certain games, especially in fighting games like Mortal Kombat, where you have to press the start button to block, and Street Fighter, where you have to press the start button to switch between kicks and punches. The Super Nintendo, on the other hand, has 8 buttons if you count start and select. It has 4 face buttons, A, B, X, and Y, and 2 shoulder buttons, L and R, which is a lifesaver in fighting games. It makes it easier to play games in general. The buttons on the Genesis controller are in a straight line, which can be really annoying jumping back and forth between buttons. The Super Nintendo buttons layout looks like modern controllers. So when it comes to the controller, I don't even think it's a debate. The Super Nintendo has 8 buttons, and the Genesis only has 4, and it makes it so much easier to play games. So when it comes to the controller, Super Nintendo gets the point. Now let's talk about the hardware. For this category, I only want to focus on how these consoles look and not focus on the specs. The Genesis has a modern, slick black design. It matches well with the image that the Genesis was going for. The Super Nintendo looks like a gray brick with purple switches on it, and over time, a lot of Super Nintendos would turn yellow. Even though I think the Sega Genesis is a way better looking console, let's take a look at what's inside of them. The Sega Genesis was powered by a Motorola 68000 CPU, and the Super Nintendo had a Ricoh 5A22 CPU. Each consoles had their own strengths and weaknesses, and those technical differences affected how games looked, sounded, and were played. I think specs for this generation doesn't really matter. It's more about how the game feels and how the game looks. So for this category, since we're only talking about how these consoles look, the Sega Genesis has the upper hand. When it comes to the graphics, if we're being technical, the Super Nintendo is the more powerful machine. It has a bigger color palette, more advanced effects, and overall better visual capabilities, and it all makes sense. The Super Nintendo is the more recent console. Naturally, a system released 2 years later is gonna look better on paper, but even then, the Genesis still holds up pretty well with the Super Nintendo, and in a lot of cases, the difference is not that big between the two consoles. Many games on both consoles look surprisingly similar, and sometimes the Genesis version looks better depending on which game you're comparing. If we compare the same titles side by side, it becomes clear that each console had their own style. The Super Nintendo definitely had technical advantages, especially with features like Mode 7, which let developers rotate and scale backgrounds to create that fake 3D look in games like F-Zero and Super Mario Kart. And then, you have the Super FX chip, a special enhancement chip built directly into certain cartridges. The FX chip pushed the Super Nintendo to its limit, with 3D shapes in games like Star Fox, an incredible visual style of Yoshi's Island. But that doesn't mean that the Genesis was lacking, not even close. The Genesis had a very distinct art style, darker tones, and a faster feel, and some of its games look absolutely phenomenal, even to this day. All the Sonic games still hold up visually, with their bright colors and fast-moving environments. Comic Zone is another great example. It pretty much looks like a playable comic book, with some of the most unique visuals in the entire 16-bit era. And even lesser known titles like Alien Soldier shows how far the Sega Genesis could go. At the end of the day, both systems are extremely comparable, and which one looks better really depends on personal preference. But for me, The Super Nintendo always looked better. The visuals just felt more polished across the board. So when it comes to the graphics, Super Nintendo gets the point. Now let's talk about one of the most iconic part of the 16-bit era, the music. Both consoles had completely different approaches to sound, and that's what made their games feel so unique. So in this category, we're gonna compare music from the two consoles to figure out which one sounds better. Because they had different hardware, they both sounded very different. The Genesis had a more gritty, heavy metal sound. It's hard to explain, but when you hear a Sega Genesis game, you automatically know it. The Genesis has a unique sound to it. The Super Nintendo had more of an orchestral type of sound. The music really sounded like music. Not that the Genesis didn't, but it sounds a bit more polished. This segment will be separated into 3 sections. In the first one, we're gonna compare games that came out on both consoles. The second one is gonna be about the Genesis exclusives, and the third one is gonna be about the Super Nintendo exclusives. Let's start by comparing music from the same game to see which one sounds better. If we take Battletoad Double Dragon for example, it obviously sounds better on the Super Nintendo, and I feel like it's the case for a lot of games. Street Fighter sounds similar, but it sounds a bit better on the Super Nintendo. Earthworm Jim is an example of a game that I think sounds better on the Genesis, at least in my opinion. Even the Capcom and the Konami intro sounds different. Spider-Man and Venom is night and day in my opinion. For rock and roll racing, the Super Nintendo version sounds way better.
The stage is set. The green flag drops. Clock jams into first. Jake is dominating.
And last example, NBA Jam, which sounds a bit more jazzy in the Super Nintendo version. The Super Nintendo sounding better than all those games doesn't mean that the Genesis sounds bad at all. But for this segment, the Super Nintendo definitely gets the point. Now let's listen to some Sega Genesis music. For this part, I'm gonna shut up and let you hear the music.
let's listen to some Super Nintendo songs. Now last but not least, this is one of my hidden gems on the Super Nintendo when it comes to the music, Waterworld. The game is trash, but the music is amazing. Just listen to this. And this song just makes me feel sad. Yeah, Super Nintendo gets the point. Now let's talk about the most important part of the 16-bit era, the games. Both consoles had a deep library of games. At the end of the day, it didn't really matter which console you had, you wasn't gonna get bored. Each console had amazing games. As mentioned before in this video, a lot of games that came out for both consoles were similar and sometimes almost identical. For example, Spider-Man and Venom, Rock'n'Roll Racing, Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat, Zombies Ate My Neighbors, and the list goes on and on. Which version is better depends on personal preference. So for those games, it didn't really matter which version you had, you were not missing out. A game that made a bit controversy though was Mortal Kombat. The Super Nintendo version had no blood in it, and also some fatalities were changed. The Genesis version had blood in it, but you had to use a cheat code to activate it. And because of that, some people would say that the Super Nintendo was a kid or family-oriented console. That ended up being false. Mortal Kombat 2 and 3 had blood in them, and there's a lot of Super Nintendo games with blood. Then, you have games that came out on both consoles, but were totally different. For example, the Aladdin games. Technically, it's the same game, but both versions are so different that it's a completely different experience. Some game franchise came out for both consoles, but with different titles. The Super Nintendo had Super Castlevania 4, and the Sega Genesis had Castlevania Bloodlines. The Super Nintendo had Turtles in Time, and the Genesis had the Hyperstone Heist. The Super Nintendo had Contra 3, and the Genesis had Contra Hard Corps.
Now let's talk about the Sega Genesis exclusives. The Genesis brought a completely different energy. The library leaned heavily into action, speed, and arcade-style gameplay. Sega wanted their games to feel bold, intense, and exciting, especially for teens and young adults. One of Sega's biggest strengths was its arcade DNA. Sega had a strong ties to arcades, and it showed. Genres like beat-em-ups, run-and-guns, and shooters thrived on the system. The games felt fast and responsive. Titles like Streets of Rage, Gunstar Heroes, Shinobi, Alien Soldier, and Thunder Force 4 delivered non-stop action and pushed players' reflexes to the limit. The Genesis also became known for speed, and no game represents that better than Sonic the Hedgehog. Games like Rocket Knight Adventures and Restar kept that fast-paced philosophy alive while adding variety and personality. Sega also had amazing third-party games like Echo the Dolphin, Vectorman, Comic Zone, and Landstalker. Some of these games were weird, some were ambitious, but at the end of the day, they were memorable. The Genesis also had its fair share of RPG games like Phantasy Star. And if you're into sports game, Genesis is your console. There is plenty of sports games on the Genesis. From basketball to hockey to baseball, it didn't really matter. They have it all. So overall, the Genesis library sometimes felt rougher around the edges, but that was part of its charm. It wasn't always about perfection, it was about personality. For the Super Nintendo, Nintendo put a massive emphasis on balance, pacing, and creativity. The Super Nintendo built its reputation on first and third party titles. A huge advantage of the Super Nintendo was its RPG library. Games like Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, Earthbound, and Secret of Mana set the standard for what console RPGs could be. These games offered deep stories, emotional moments, unforgettable characters, and soundtracks that are still praised today. Even Super Mario RPG was a great title. Nintendo also dominated the platforming genre with Super Mario World, Donkey Kong Country, Yoshi's Island, and Super Metroid. The Super Nintendo delivered some of the most polished and creative platformers ever made. Other standout titles like Kirby and Mega Man X showed how versatile and redefined Super Nintendo platforming could be. The Super Nintendo also excelled at slower and more thoughtful action games. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past set the standard for action-adventure design, blending exploration, puzzles, and combat into a perfectly paced experience. These games rewarded curiosity and patience, making the Super Nintendo feel like a console built for immersive, meaningful adventures. Another major factor was Nintendo's strong relationship with Japanese devs. Like mentioned before, Squaresoft, Capcom, and Konami consistently delivered high-quality exclusives. Because of this, the Super Nintendo often felt like the home of premium must-play titles. So overall, when it comes to the games, I think the Super Nintendo has the edge. While the Genesis has amazing games, the Super Nintendo library is more impressive. There's a lot of games that I didn't mention in this video. The Super Nintendo library is just amazing. So when it comes to the games, Super Nintendo gets the point. So that's gonna wrap up this video, and if you made it this far, I really appreciate it. For real. The Super Nintendo vs Sega Genesis is one of the most legendary rivalries in gaming history, if not the greatest. And I don't think there's a wrong answer here. Both consoles are amazing. And yeah, I'd like to hear from you guys which console you think is better, the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis. Leave it down in the comments below. Let me know some of your favorite games or favorite memories tied to the 16-bit era. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next video. It really helps the channel more than you think. And again, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I just reached 500 subscribers, which is, it may not be a lot for some people, but for me, it's actually insane. And I really want to thank every single one of you guys. And yeah, I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.